we want to go position by position on the ranks. One of the ranks that I noticed when I looked over at the tight end position was Pat Freiermuth, who I'm very low on. And also when I was looking at the receiver position was George Pickens, who I'm also very low on. And a big part of that when I go through the projections is the Arthur Smith effect. No surprise. But when you really dig into the pass rate over expected and the way that they've played the last couple of years, in addition to that, the fact that the Steelers have also run a very negative pass rate over expected for a couple of years since Ben Roethlisberger retired. The quarterbacks, the specific quarterbacks, whether it's Wilson or Fields, you're talking about probably a high sack rate. You're talking about a higher than average rate. Just looking at the called pass plays that will become pass attempts. And with Fields, that gap is larger than any quarterback because he does hold the ball long and takes sacks at a high rate and scrambles at a high rate as well. Those are the other two outcomes on a called pass other than a pass attempt is a sack or a scramble. Basically, the ball never gets out of the quarterback's hand. That tends to happen at a very high rate, either of those. With Fields, it makes him a fun fantasy quarterback because he will take off and run for big yardage. But I have a real issue, even if Pickens is a hit, even if I understand and agree with you and have long felt that Justin Fields doesn't get enough credit as for the accuracy, especially as a downfield passer. And I think the Fields and Pickens fit is actually really pretty nice. Even if I think that means Pickens is going to have some explosive splash plays, it's sort of similar to the points you were making at quarterback about best ball versus managed, but I still would have a hard time with it in best ball. But I could start to see the ceiling in best ball. The managed stuff, to me, Pickens' scoring profile would be so hit or miss. It'd be really hard to know when to start. And the reality of the volume in the pass offense, where I'm very confident the pass rate's going to be below average and probably meaningfully below average, and that this team's also probably going to play fairly slow because they're going to want to be sort of a run and defense-based team. You don't see Arthur Smith receivers get up there in targets. No Arthur Smith receiver has had more than 120 targets. People are like, what about when he had A.J. Brown? If you go look at A.J. Brown's career, just go look at his stats. It is very clear that Arthur Smith was holding back A.J. Brown. He never had more than, I think, 1,100 yards in an Arthur Smith offense. He immediately goes to Philly with a rushing quarterback and has 1,400 in back-to-back seasons. Like, it's not... Like, A.J. Brown is really, really good. It's more like A.J. Brown made Arthur Smith, if you ask me, my opinion. But, that's probably not surprising. But no Arthur Smith receivers ever had more than 120 targets. No Russell Wilson receiver last year had more than 100 targets. We did get from Fields last year, the DJ Moore season, where he really locked into his number one, and we got big-time volume there. But prior to that, Fields' pass volume was low enough that we weren't getting huge Fields receiver production volume-wise. I'm very concerned, I would say, about how the receiving, even in a hit scenario, even when Justin Fields is good, even when the Steelers are good, how the receiving volume can manifest. Because we also know that Arthur Smith's going to do some stuff with some design plays to secondary pieces that are going to keep the target shares from getting into massive, numbers like we saw with Jonnu Smith last year, right? There's going to be some stuff like that. I definitely don't think you go bet on the secondary receivers. People think it's like a zero-sum thing where it's like, well, if you're down on Pickens and Freiermuth, who are you playing for this passing game? The answer is I'm not playing anyone. I don't think there's enough full season ceiling to justify any of them. For Pickens, the price is way too lofty for me. For Freiermuth, the price is more palatable, but he does go in that next tier outside the really intriguing tight ends. And I think you need to be able to tell yourself some real upside scenarios to justify not just waiting till the end of the draft. Like, I'm willing to do it with Cole Kmet and Luke Musgrave, who I can tell myself some real upside scenarios for. I can't tell myself that with Freiermuth, so I'd rather just wait till the end of the draft and go get whoever. Juwan Johnson's the one I've been obsessed with lately. What am I missing with Pickens and Freiermuth in the ways that their profile could really look with Fields as a quarterback? Because I think that's the real upside scenario in both of our minds.
I don't think you're missing anything, right? I think the main thing with Pickens is, again, this question of how far do you want to push him down to make sure you're not drafting. I've never drafted him this year, and obviously I've participated in a number of drafts. I do think that it is in some ways a little bit interesting, though, how this could potentially work compared to the situation with Barkley. Now, the situation with Barkley, I think, is still interesting because we could get a very different Philadelphia Eagles offense in 2024. And it could be that some of the things with the blocking in New York was so bad that it covered up some other elements. Now, one of the things I've talked about with Barkley is that when you look at his rushing peripherals, they're absolutely terrible. But he does have the ability to create the big play. And when I'm writing up Breece Hall as someone that you basically have to get in every single format, there are some similarities between Breece Hall and Saquon Barkley that you have to be aware of where inconsistencies might be in terms of how you're portraying these players. Breece Hall had really good peripherals as a rookie. They weren't actually that great last year as a rusher, except for the fact that he is a big play machine and he has that. But Barkley probably has it too. And so if we're going to look at these guys very differently, then you want to make sure you're calibrated. You want to make sure those things are making sense and you really understand why they're two different guys. And they are, right? I want to continue to emphasize that, but I just want to make sure that I'm not being inconsistent in terms of how I'm portraying things.
But real quick, can I ask you a question on that? Because
Yeah.
I have Breece's peripherals last year still being really strong. His yards after contact per attempt, rushing, still in the really strong range, like better than.
Well, one of the elements with Hall is that if you look at his performance at Iowa State and then you look at his performance last year, the ability to evade tackles as a runner is not elite. Now, he was very good during that stretch as a rookie. With someone like a Breece Hall, you're going to get yards after contact simply because you're going to get big plays. Mm-hmm. And so he doesn't necessarily have to make as many guys miss. He doesn't have to break as many tackles. There was that stretch last season where he's in the midst of this extraordinary play and he is carrying the offense on his back. And I think to, more or less distract from how bad the quarterback play was. And, and you can say, well, you're a superstar, still get better, right? Don't be content with being anything other than Michael Jordan, right? Be the greatest guy. And so the coach comes out and says, look, one of the problems we're having is that Breece Hall is going down at first contact too easily. He's got to fight.
And I don't remember this.
I don't think it was, some huge thing, but just him coming out and saying, look, we'd love for Breece Hall to play better because he still has that in him. Right.
That seems crazy. So the other thing on the missed tackles, so the evaded tackles and all that is going to be a little bit different. You're looking at it on the rushing stuff. I have some PFF numbers and I have it per touch. And he was a little bit better in year 2 than year 1 in that regard. So was he maybe had a lot more evaded the receiving evasion. Okay. And that's a little bit different because you're out in space. You're going up against maybe like some lighter guys and stuff like that. So maybe a little bit of a different.
And that's one of the reasons why I do still have him. I've gone back and forth on this because you're a heavy influence on me with Bijan Robinson. And certainly I want to point out Bijan Robinson's evasion numbers in college were extraordinary. His season last year was better, I think, than people realize. You watch him play, it just blows you away that someone of that size can move like that. Mm-hmm. I still actually think Breece Hall is a better receiving back. I think he's going to score more receiving points. Breece Hall last season scored more receiving points per game from week 5 on, which again, the first month he played and he did score some points, but he was in that segment where they were bringing him back from the injury. He was way down from a snap share and a touch perspective from what he would be. Week 5 on, Breece Hall outscored Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara as a receiving back.
But one of the wild
as a receiving back.
Yeah, I know. That's crazy. One of the wild things about that though is also just the Zach Wilson effect, because as a rookie, he actually had a 5.3 ADOT. Like he was getting some downfield looks and stuff. And then last year it was a negative 0.4, which happens sometimes with the running backs, but it was all just dump offs, right? It was like, we can't throw the ball downfield. We're just going to dump it off to Breece Hall and hope he does something miraculous. And he did multiple times because he was so good. But there's a little bit of like, if they can functionally throw downfield, does that impact him? But they also are going to include him in the passing game, because Rodgers likes to throw to his backs intentionally, not just on checkdowns. So there's a push and pull with a different quarterback.
Sure. It's interesting that his ADOT is that low when, I don't think this is a false memory, but in that early stretch when they still weren't playing him that much, he runs a crossing pattern in, the third or fourth quarter of one of these games, catches the ball, it's inside the 20, right? And you're thinking, okay, he just caught the pass. That's going to be worth, 2 points on its own because he's down the field. But there are guys who have the angle, and then you're like, oh no, it's just a big dude, right? It's Breece Hall, but nobody has the angle on Breece Hall. He's going to score easily, which he did. Breece Hall, very, very good. I allow us to get a little bit sidetracked because I wanted to discuss what I see as like slight differences between Barkley and someone else that I'm not drafting at all, which is, the George Pickens question you asked. I think that with Pickens and Freiermuth, we do have this situation where the target competition is so minimal that they could back into numbers that justify their prices. I have a hard time seeing an upside scenario from where they're being selected for all of those reasons that you mentioned. I do think that if you have sort of a shot-based offense, that potentially works for Pickens. Now, one of the things when it was looking like it would definitely be Russell Wilson, is you're like, Russell Wilson actually cannot throw the deep ball anymore. And you dive into Jerry Jeudy's numbers, how much they declined from 2022 to 2023, specifically on deep targets. And then you think back to, some of our Sunday night recordings where like Jerry Jeudy was behind the defense. He was clear of everybody by 6 yards. The pass landed in a different section of the field. It looked like a punt.
Like, throw him toward the open space, not away from where he's running.
Justin Fields brings serious weaknesses, which is the reason that, like, very bizarrely, teams that desperately needed quarterbacks thought that imagine what the Las Vegas Raiders would be like today if they had Devontae Adams, Brock Bowers, and Justin Fields. Some of the decisions people have made are so bizarre. You look at the Vikings, and the Vikings have a Super Bowl contender that is going to be captained either by Sam Darnold or JJ McCarthy, a quarterback that they did not want at all. Well,
some of the reports on Fields were that they took less because they let him choose his destination and he wanted to go to Pittsburgh, I think was one of the reports. That's the way that.
Well, that may make sense, right? But I think that it's like when you have someone you can't keep on your dynasty roster, and there's somebody who has been very easy to get along with, and you make a lot of good trades, and when you send them trades, they don't send you offensive messages back, and they offer you a 7th round pick, and someone else who is always trying to get something for free and responds negatively offers you a 6th round pick, and you send the guy out for the 7th round pick. If you had gotten a 2nd round pick, that's the offer that you would have taken.
Yeah.
Possibly, right? I think that it's very strange to me that we're in an environment where you have multiple teams in the Patriots and the Vikings selecting project quarterbacks as opposed to simply waiting and taking someone in the next year. A lot of people think it's weird that the Broncos have taken a backup level talent and want to pretend that he's the next Drew Brees. Most people don't understand why the Raiders have failed to address the QB position when we're talking about Anthony Richardson, we're talking about Jaden Daniels, we're talking about some of these guys who there are scenarios in which they play better than what Justin Fields has done, but a lot of their outcomes are actually centered around what Justin Fields has already given the NFL. And so from that perspective, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But one of the things I think with Fields is he's interesting within the context of a Steelers team that doesn't need a dynamic quarterback or isn't going to use a dynamic quarterback anyway. 1, because they're going to be built around their defense. 2, because they're going to be built around running the ball. 3, because Arthur Smith is their coordinator and is going to compress the outcomes, at least to the upside that the quarterback can have anyway. He just seems like a good fit, right? He seems like a good fit. Then you add in the ability to throw the ball down the field. One of the things that's sort of bizarre, and I wouldn't suggest people draw any strong conclusions from this, but in building out the big QB piece that came out last week, I wanted to work through this relationship between quarterbacks and the receivers and how that dynamic played out in terms of creating wins. And you can think about it
which
from a
was
best ball perspective.
fantastic. I referenced this piece in a write-up. It's a fantastic piece. If you haven't read it yet, you got to go read it. I just wanted to cut in and say that. But the relationship you're talking about was a fantastic part of the piece as well.
Thank you. It was fun. And it was fun for me in part because I got to use the RotoViz tools in a way that was exciting. Even if you don't like hearing from me or reading our stuff, we've got 30 plus tools, Ben, that are pretty good. You can subscribe if you want. The interesting thing on Fields was that in 2022, where he has this massive rushing breakout, you wouldn't have wanted to put him with his receivers. It would have hurt you to do that because your incentive as the fantasy manager was to have him run. The really insane thing, though, was that last year, if you had DJ Moore and Cole Kmet together, those two guys would have combined for a fantastic win rate. And that's the thing that you've noted several times as we work through where Kmet is as a player. And I don't think that George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth are going to be DJ Moore and Cole Kmet for a variety of reasons, one of which is Arthur Smith. But when those guys have no target competition, and we've liked them in the past sort of in a vacuum, there is a scenario for me where they hit, and if I am even more negative in my ranks, then the ranks end up being off, being wrong in a way that I think is not exactly the direction I want to go. For those guys, I can see it. And one of the things with Pickens is that he just is such a difficult player. We know that he doesn't want to block and that they're not going to hold him accountable. We know, or we think we know, that it's going to be difficult for him to consistently draw a lot of targets. That's something that has been the case for him, even going back to when he was a star at Georgia. Now, maybe there are some things within the Georgia context that are a little bit tricky as well. We know they've got other receivers coming out of that program who are very trendy this year, despite some warts and what have you. But the argument that we made at RotoViz for him last year is that things like the catch version of ESPN's receiving score, while it's not as predictive of itself, is actually very similar in its ability to predict fantasy scoring, which is what you care about. Blair Andrews wrote a really fantastic piece on this. And then Blair combined that with an argument talking about how, because we've gotten so caught up in some of these advanced stats that are sticky, we end up as a community overrating the importance of those as it relates to scoring. And as you think through this relationship between scoring and ADP, which, I mean, we want the points, but we want to beat the prices. And so this touchdown potential for Pickens was a big deal, right? His ability to do some of those things was going to matter. It looked for the vast majority of the season like that take was going to be wrong. And then Pickens blows up for these extraordinary games at the end that have moved him into a price range that, for me, even if he had better quarterback play, would be pretty tricky when we have now gotten a second NFL season from him and watched him develop in a way that is both good and bad. When you then put it in the context of an Arthur Smith offense, and we don't know if you're going to get bad quarterback play or awful quarterback play, which probably seem like the two options, I don't think that you can draft him. And yet he's in a weird context with the team where they have so little that it would potentially inflate that target earning ability, which is the weakness. And if you do get Justin Fields and you do get the ability to attack down the field and you do get Pickens over the top, you get some of those plays that we saw from DJ Moore last year that really got him off to the races. It doesn't take a huge number of long scores during the course of the NFL season to really change, influence, supercharge, however you want to look at it, the scoring profile for a guy if his overall volume is okay.
That's all very interesting. I to wrap it up, it feels like, though, you're trying to make a little bit of a case on a situation that you mostly don't want to be in on, and you're very comfortable playing the Steelers through Fields unstacked, essentially, which has sort of been my read, is that, and it's almost like Fields and the running backs, like, because I do think the running backs would benefit as well. If the Steelers offense is really good, Fields, to your point about not wanting to have stacked him with the players last year, is probably doing a lot of running. There's going to be some splashy receiving stuff, but that's not going to be, I mean, you're not actively seeking out Pickens and Freiermuth. It's more of a devil's advocate case.
Right. Just that I think that I have Pickens about a round and a half below ADP, which is pretty significant.
It's funny that the guys that I'm attracted to in our ranks are guys that we're both out on, and how far out we are. Because I have another question for you on a running back that I ranked very low, but I'm worried that I'm too low on him. And yet when I look at his peripherals, they're that bad. And I also consider the change in coordinator. The player's Alvin Kamara. So they've had Pete Carmichael forever. They still had him as the offensive coordinator after Sean Payton left. He was the Sean Payton coordinator. They're going to a Clint Kubiak system now. Last year, Kamara got a ton of receiving underneath. But again, I look at the running back ADOT stuff a little bit. He's had an ADOT of at least 1+ downfield, 1+ yards downfield for each of the 3 prior seasons, where he would actually get out into some routes at times. Last year, it was all this target volume at a I think either a negative ADOT or a 0.1 ADOT or something. I think it was 0.1. I think he had 9 air yards on the season. And so it's all dump offs, like I was describing for Brees and that other offense. They might still have a lot of that because they don't have a lot of underneath targets. That's why I've gotten a little bit into Juwan Johnson. But outside just the PPR reception stuff for Kamara, the rest of it is pretty concerning. The peripherals went to hell last year. Or excuse me, they went to crap last year.
He's not a good running back at this point in his career, which was the reason Kendre Miller was so exciting. But I mean,
so
somebody's going to have to fill that vacuum.
Somebody's going to have to play. Yeah. They don't want to use Kendre Miller. It's part of the reason I'm still leaving a candle lit for Kendre Miller, despite his coach talking about cutting him. The way that I've decided to interpret that, Sean, is that he was so disappointed because he was ready to rely on Kendre. Like, they knew that they needed Kendre, and so that's why the disappointment came out in that way, hoping that Kendre can get healthy and actually see his value rebound, because it's not Jamal Williams, and I have Kamara ranked down in the like Eckler, Ezekiel Elliott, Gus Edwards tier as guys that I'm completely out on. And I do think there's a little bit of a meaningful point here, and that it's like we're never going to be in on these guys, Sean. But for people like us, even though we're going to tend to be out on it, is Kamara one that you have ranked where you do just because it's like a question of how far low can you get him to never take him? Or are there things that you're actually seeing in his profile that you could see scenarios where you might actually click on him, or other people who are trying to parse whether to push this type of back all the way down might be more like, I get questions that are like, well, would you ever really take Zeke? And I'm like, no, I literally never would. I literally, like, you're not going to convince me that I would want to take Zeke. I don't think there's enough ceiling. I could see him score a bunch of touchdowns. I could see him catch a bunch of passes. I understand that Dallas needs to have a running back. His peripherals and everything that he's done have gone so downhill for so long. And people are like, well, what about last year? Look what he did with New England. You're just being stubborn. If I could be confident that he could be the player he was for all of last year with New England, all year this year, despite the multi-year decline, you might be able to talk me into drafting him.
But his peripherals were the worst in football last year.
Right.
I think that's the weird thing, is that.
Yeah. But I also think
he caught some dump off passes where the defense is just like, we've more or less quit because you guys are giving us such a minimal challenge. We will let you throw a negative pass to Ezekiel Elliott underneath. Ramondre Stevenson was awful last year and was maybe the single most disappointing player to me in all of football from a talent perspective when you look at what he had been before and what he did last year, and there was still a massive gulf between him and Ezekiel Elliott. I just want to throw that out there. Not that, I mean, it's going to change anybody's mind, because it's a pure volume play.
Right. It's a pure volume play. And yet my concern to put a ball on that is, even if I could be sure he was the player he was last year in New England, as bad as you just described it, I might actually take him in some situations, but you can't be sure of that. He can get worse still, right? Like, he can still go further off that age cliff. That's just the reality of where he's at in his career. You're taking a guy who went over an age cliff like 3 seasons ago and has been clinging. What's the ceiling? The ceiling is that you get some small win of volume. And anyway, I don't even think in a redraft league you'd ever really want to start him. Like you're just like it's a touchdown play sort of a thing.
I don't
Regardless,
think that you can take him in redraft. I have never taken him, but I do think at a certain point in best ball,
yeah, you can make.
I wouldn't want to, but you could take him.
Yeah, but so I'm using him as an example of a guy that you actually have. I think it's 2 tiers below Kamara. You still have Kamara in a range. Now his ADP is a lot higher. You still have him in a range that is, I mean, it's at least feasible to me that he could be the top pick at some point in a specific draft. I have him in that tier with Zeke and those other guys that, I mean, I mentioned Eckler as well. And I do think Eckler is an intriguing one for a bounce back, but then the way that his profile hits, because they're probably not going to get a lot of running back receiving with Jaden Daniels, is like, now I have to get 2 things right. I need him to bounce back.
The other little problem is that Brian Robinson is actually a pretty good receiving.
Yeah, and then you have a second back there, and so I'm out. I have Robinson in that tier as well. I'm out on the Washington running backs, which I think you are as well. I think we've talked about that one, but so I'm not saying I'm
RB 18.
Is
you have him at running back 41? I think being out on Kamara makes sense.
Okay,
but I do want to give you a little bit of a hard time on this. We'll look at the tier above it.
He's an RB 18. Where? How is he going RB 18?
Ben, he scored a lot of points last year.
Oh my god!
Which again doesn't mean it'll carry over, but
the important element for me is to understand that you are not saying that there's a reason I should be drafting him. It's just that I've ranked him way too low.
I think you probably have, and I want to joke with you a bit about this previous tier. Because you have some interesting tier breaks here where we have top 3, top 8, top 12, and then kind of a very large tier that has the mini tier breaks. We get to the third of the 3 groups within this kind of big tier, the one that goes from 24 to 39. To me, the guys in that 24 to 39 range feel like they have some substantial differences when we're thinking about maybe not what the talent profile is, but if they have a similar talent profile and just a dramatically different context going into the season, that maybe there should be a tier break, even if the order could be right, but maybe a tier break would be deserved. So I'm thinking about from 24 where Stevenson is to 31 or 30. I mean, Zamir White to me is fragile enough that you could move him into a group with guys who maybe don't have any volume. On the other side of that, though, we have Blake Corum, who is interesting because he's such a massive contingent play. But then we have a lot of guys who, I mean, in some cases, like Trey Benson might be the RB3, Jalen Wright almost certainly the RB3. I mean, we kind of joked about this where we got a lot of feedback on our BBT show about who the backup was for Dallas. I mean, you have Dowdle ahead of Elliott.
So you're saying I should.
The fact that he's not going to be again, sort of joking with you. There's a potential that he is not the backup.
So you're saying I shouldn't have Trey Benson and Jalen Wright a tier ahead of Alvin Kamara? Just purely on contingent value. I mean, the Benson argument is very fair. He seems very, very buried. But I still think, James Conner's never played a full season in his entire career. And he typically only plays about 13 games, despite the fact that he does carry a pretty strong workload when he plays and is pretty reliable in that regard. He's always played at least 10 games. He's really weird. He's always missed some games, but never had a major injury. And he's a reliable back in my mind. But in a 17-game season, I do think you're expecting him to miss a couple of games probably at this stage of his career. And I think Benson gives you some real intriguing plug-and-play redraft weekly upside in those cases, even with the Emery Demercado conversations. So that's why I still have him in the same tier as like a Blake Corum, even though I have him meaningfully below. But yeah, I do think, and Wright, I think the upside case for Wright is actually really straightforward, which is like if either of the backs miss, he's lighting up camp. I mean, he's the one that I should probably actually have ahead of Benson. I have him behind Benson. But if either Mostert or Achane misses and they both have had injury issues in their past, you probably have Wright stepping into a really valuable situation, even though he's going to be only at like the 35% snap share side of a committee, probably like that 35% could still be kind of fun, right? And over a stretch of time, and especially if there's a major injury, I think it could develop into something really huge. So to me, it's like thinking through the 17-week season and these guys that don't have any guaranteed roles, like the Corums and the Bensons and the Wrights, but also like when they hit and how they hit, how their scoring profile manifests, and what to me, like I totally understand your point that in a tiering system, some guaranteed volume with lower ceiling versus that. Like I have Devin Singletary in this group, and I think we both like Devin Singletary. It's a better example than Zamir White, but like I don't think Devin Singletary has the type of weekly ceiling that Jalen Wright or Trey Benson could offer at some point this year. Even though Devin Singletary is clearly in some builds a really nice option because of basically the weekly floor and the stability at his price that he's going to give you. He's going to probably be at least a small hit, maybe a medium-sized hit with how cheap he is. I think people are underestimating what Devin Singletary can be this year. And yet, as I think through like building out my running back rooms and the value of these players and trying to identify the value between that type of stability with limited upside and basically a potential for a zero. Like Trey Benson could be a total zero this year, but the potential also to provide my build with some real spot start upside at some point. I end up saying like, I actually like all these guys in the same tier. I don't want to delineate and say that, Devin Singletary needs to be in a tier above, Blake Corum because of week 1 usage. Right.
Well, maybe the names that pop out then are Stevenson and Spears.
You want them in a higher tier.
Why aren't those guys up?
Yeah. Spears, I'm probably light on. Sean, I'm convinced that the Titans are going to be the worst team in football this year. I'm not buying the Brian Callahan stuff. I think Will Levis is terrible. And now DeAndre Hopkins has gotten hurt. When I wrote them up in my offseason stealing signals piece, I wrote that DeAndre Hopkins really needed to have a good year, but that this was a really fragile team if he goes down. Calvin Ridley has not been the player that people think he is. And doing some research, noted that DeAndre Hopkins is 2 years older than Calvin Ridley and has, I think, 8 seasons better than Calvin Ridley's second best season. And people want to believe that Calvin Ridley should be, before the injury, should be drafted higher than DeAndre Hopkins, despite being, again, only 2 years younger. He's probably not going to provide the value that I think people think he's going to provide to the offense. Some of the clips of Ridley
with, sorry to pull you on a little bit of a digression here, but
we've talked about them. But I was just going to real quick say some of the clips of Ridley have been hilarious because he gets wide open and then the throw is like, there was one where he got wide open on the sideline and they're like, he makes this great catch. And I'm like, he's standing wide open on the sideline. That throws 5 yards out of bounds. The only reason he had to make that catch is because the quarterback sucks. Anyway, what were you going to ask?
Well, I was going to ask, again, we're getting very different types of reports. And I think the reports do matter. All of the college football people, and again, we've been lucky enough to have some really good college football folks work with RotoViz. Their skepticism of the ability of Anthony Richardson and Will Levis to throw the ball was extremely high. I don't know that we have the information yet to completely change everything we think about Richardson, but certainly with the quality of the receivers, with the rapport with Josh Downs. And one of the things with Richardson is the inability to throw underneath. But I mean, if he's lighting it up to Downs, then a lot of that goes away. If we're willing to give him a little bit of room to potentially blossom at the NFL level, do we have to give Will Levis a little bit as well? I guess the thing with Levis, you watch him play, he's extremely competitive. He's extremely athletic outside of his arm. And then his arm, the arm talent there, if you're just talking about the ability to throw it hard, is
well, and some
elite.
of his deep balls look incredible. You will see some really great Will Levis throws, but it's just like, it feels very random.
So Colin and I got in a point in our OT listener league dynasty startup draft where Bryce Young seemed to be the best pick. And we did make that pick. And I was working on some more. Then I think I can get this away. I'm working on a Garrett Wilson article. And one of the things that you have to talk a little bit about is that even though everybody knows how bad Zach Wilson was, it's important to really completely calibrate to just how bad, so you can understand what, like, the size of the improvement, right? Because it's not enough to say there's going to be an improvement. I bring that up because the other names who are laboring down in Zach Wilson territory are Bryce Young and Will Levis. And Bryce Young was a very good college player. He was the number one pick. He's been surrounded with weapons. Will Levis was a terrible college player. And you mentioned that the weapons are not very good. So even though there's a lot of reason for trepidation on both plays, they are two very different plays. I mean, I keep trying to think through whether I'm just being too close-minded on Levis. I mean, if the Titans are decent, then, I mean, so also I do have Spears ranked, not necessarily aggressively, but in an area where I take him quite a bit. I think he's fantastic. I think that Tony Pollard is probably not great. They've been listed as number ones, which doesn't mean anything
already
other
means
than
Spears. Yeah, you already want to play Spears. I have Pollard a big tier break below Spears even. And when I wrote it up, I was like, Spears is the one player that you actually want access to in this offense. But I guess I'm concerned about the ceiling. You've compelled me that I should move Spears up. I'm a little concerned about how the ceiling manifests with the whole offense. I had a similar conversation to what you were just describing with Pat Kerrane about Levis versus Young. Though I would describe it why I'm actually willing to buy back into the Carolina offense a little bit, based on the longer view profile stuff for Young, but also that I think Levis actually had decent receivers last year and wasn't able to get anything out. I mean, like, the only production he really had was when DeAndre Hopkins made a nice play on the other end of like some bombs. And then everything else was like completions behind the line of scrimmage. I'm not sure this guy's ever completed a pass to the intermediate range of the field. Bryce Young,
he was going to also give you more athletic dynamism when he's back there and can't figure things out than Young probably does. Not that Young, if something's open, won't take those yards and then slide, but he's not going to save a broken play.
Yeah, sure.
Like, Will Levis is going to only have broken plays, so he needs to save a few of them.
The Young stuff for me is just like, I can tell myself a case that the situation was so horrible. The line was horrible. The offense was poorly conceived. The receiving core was that bad that even though I don't think he was good, I do think it's it has the potential to be a unique situation where we look back on it and we go, it kind of masked his rookie year. He's probably never going to be an elite quarterback, but like he's functional. Like a little bit like what after Trevor Lawrence's rookie year, we were like, dude, he was coached by Urban Meyer last year. It was a disaster. And then like Lawrence did kind of rebound in year two. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen with Young, but I also think, I mean, both these teams are really incentivized to make their young quarterbacks look great. But I think Young can probably do that. He can give you a floor of production when you're trying to put him in situations to succeed. And Canales seems like the kind of coach that can give you that. Whereas Levis, I'm not confident can. Like, one of the stats I've seen on Young from Jacob Gibbs at CBS, he had a stat that he was like fourth best when targeting receivers classified as open. Now, some of that might be that the only open classification was when Adam Thielen was standing at the line of scrimmage, just staring at Young, like, throw it to me.
And it's disconcerting that their camp reports suggest that he's been effective, but it's all underneath.
Yeah, I mean, maybe part of the reason he classifies as accurate to the open receivers is all of his open receivers weren't down the field, and he never had to make difficult throws to open receivers. But like, part of that is like, maybe he can actually get the ball to Deontay Johnson, who's really good at getting open, right? And so like, now maybe he has a good fit. Will Levis, to me, like, I don't know, man. When I watched him play, I was like, this guy just can't play at the NFL level. Like, it's going to be so apparent through 6 games that they're going to have to bench him. Maybe that's way too much certainty. And I know people have pointed out like Josh Allen has done it before. And, I would have been this certain about Josh Allen after his rookie year. And then he came back and was actually a really good player because Josh Allen did struggle as a passer as a rookie. But I think even that, like, Josh Allen was a top 10 pick. There was other reasons, like Levis slid all the way to the second round. He eats mayonnaise straight out of the jar. Like, there's a lot of reasons that you can't like Will Levis. And I'm just like,
Ben, you just lost every mayonnaise fan that we had as a listener.
Oh no, I actually like mayonnaise, but I'm not eating it straight out of the jar. Or I'm at least willing to have it on certain things. It's a fine condiment on a sandwich. I don't know why there's so much uproar about mayonnaise all the time, but again, I'm not eating it out of the jar. Let's just be very clear about that part of it being a little bit psychopathic. I don't know. Maybe that's actually a sign that Will Levis has some gene that is a little bit psychopathic, that you need to be great. I'm trying to consider whether I'm going to be wrong on that. But Sean, we have to make our bets, man. We can't have access to every single offense, all 32 teams. And there's just a part of me that's like, it's very similar to the Pittsburgh conversation we had earlier, where it's like, I'm willing to make a bet that we've talked in the last few years about the haves and have nots, that the Titans, there's been a lot of talk about what they're going to do differently and what Brian Callahan's going to bring to this build, this offense, and then the way they're going to do things. But like, he didn't even call the plays in Cincinnati. The offensive coordinator is the guy they brought over from Jacksonville. We were just talking about how Trevor Lawrence was not able to succeed under this offensive coordinator. Last year, they had a very disappointing offense in Jacksonville. Why is this guy the new?
And that's one of the other problems I have with Trevor Lawrence, just to kind of toss that in, is that I don't think that you can instantly say I don't even think that you can look at Sean McVay, for example, and say that he has been successful in what he was trying to do consistently over the last 5 years. I certainly don't think that you can say all of his acolytes or people who come out of the tree for Shanahan, as those coaching minds now penetrate so many different teams, as teams are looking for some type of solution to last year's defensive innovations and the way that defense has evolved over the last several years. But certainly teams that had no answers last year and are just running it back, that part, it doesn't get me completely off the guys. I mean, you're still looking at scoring. It doesn't matter how you do it. It doesn't matter if there are things you could have done better. If the players still score at a level that makes sense at the price, you can take them. But when we're thinking about small win versus big win, I mean, we'd like to believe in the offense, and for the reasons you're just saying. But one thing for me with Tyjae Spears, I think he's a fantastic talent. It's a mild problem that they have two running backs and that he was excellent last season and was actually not fantasy viable. I mean, he just is coming off of a rookie season that was fantastic, but that perfectly illustrates how in specific situations you can be really good and be in a committee that completely suppresses your scoring. And a little bit for him, you end up with sort of a weird way in which the actual scoring manifested that made him a little bit less valuable than he could have otherwise been. But I mean, it's a problem. So when I miss on Spears, I'm not as upset as I would otherwise be, even though I think that he's priced very nicely for a guy who's probably the slight, the 1A, and you're good. Like, if you're the running back 1A and you're good, you shouldn't be priced where Spears is. And yet you think through all of the context and you're like, okay, well,
it's a little tricky. But to be fair, the reason I'm saying all this really negative stuff, and we have to be humble about this stuff, man. Like, I might be wrong. Like, when I say all that as confidently as I'm saying, like, I do think through the possibility that I could be wrong. When I was throwing in the additional context about like Brian Callahan not having called plays and the OC Liam Cohen, or not Liam Cohen. I can't remember the OC's name. Liam Cohen's the guy in Tampa right now, but the OC that they brought over from Jacksonville. Like, I'm just not like nothing is favorable, but that doesn't mean that just because all these little things don't sound super favorable that like they can't actually catch lightning in a bottle a little bit. And when you were just describing how some of these teams that didn't have answers last year are running it back, I will commend them for trying something new, right? Like, they went out and got a new offensive minded head coach, and maybe Brian Callahan is the new Sean McVay. Maybe he has answers. Maybe they learned that in the meeting rooms, and that's why they hired him. And I think that's what a lot of people who are in on Tennessee believe, is that there's a wide band here. There's uncertainty, and he could maybe really elevate the way that I was just talking about. Maybe Canales could elevate Bryce Young. And if that's the case, I mean, maybe I would still argue that I don't think Will Levis is good enough for this to be a good offense. But if they're at least average, then I think Tyjae Spears doesn't have the situation that you just perfectly articulated as my concern and why I have him ranked, that he could be good and still not score. I think if they can at least be a functional offense that plays with some pace and will throw at a high rate like everyone's expecting, then you're like, well, Tyjae Spears can operate off of that. He can catch some passes in space, and he's going to add explosive plays to the situation. He'd be the one guy in the offense that you're like, all right, well, I mean, I could see him scoring a decent amount because he's the explosive, high efficiency type of committee back that we're willing to play in some of these situations, right? You've always liked this type of smaller efficiency type back. That's why you're in on like a Jaleel McLaughlin or something. It's always been a type of back that you enjoy targeting, because we know that you need efficiency to get to like legendary ceilings. The real pinnacle of that was Achane last year. Didn't get a ton of work, but he averaged almost 8 yards a carry. I mean, that efficiency can be so exciting. So You have to be really confident that everything I said about the Titans is as bad as I made it sound to be completely out on Spears to the degree that I've kind of been out on him. That's why you've gotten me back around to like, I probably should be having him a little higher. And I do take him some. Like, he's the player, and then it was Hopkins prior to the injury, but now it's basically just Spears that I take when I'm like, this is my, all right, I'm going to be wrong on the Titans. These are the guys that I think would actually benefit from that, would be Spears and Hopkins, and arguably Treylon Burks is the other one that, like, I think you could say maybe he is the guy that elevates the whole thing, because I don't think he's as dead as some people think. So it's I don't want to be too confident in the team level thing. I think people were too confident in that with the Bucks last year, right? And you and I were both like willing to look at that more favorably, but there was, I think, reasons to be a little more favorable with the Bucks stuff. But still, like, it ended up being a very profitable situation. I don't want to miss out on that entirely because I'm just confident that Will Levis is terrible. But the way that I would play it if I was going to try to play into it is with Spears. So it makes sense.
Then as we're going through some of the running backs here, the next thing I wanted to ask you about and wanted to sort of beg for was to get Kenneth Walker into the tier with Henry and Pacheco and Cook. And I kind of see that quietly as the show has progressed, he has moved into that tier.
He already did that. He already moved into that tier. I was very close to doing that. And then I saw a report last night, I think laying in bed, reading some stuff on my phone about, I was reading that, I believe it's the ESPN piece that had been passed around. I was late to get around to it, but they were talking about how Walker, don't be surprised if he sets a career high in touches this year and in rush attempts. And when you start hearing that from camp and you're like, I'm already in on this guy. I mean, that was the thing. I was like, I got to get him up in that tier. I literally was thinking about it in bed last night. So that had nothing to do with looking at your ranks or anything. I know you're really high on Walker, but it just had to do with me staring at my own ranks while we're recording and being like, oh yeah, I was going to bump Walker up here. I need to bump him up. So I'm glad that we're on the same page there, though. You were gonna pitch that to me.